So I am going to talk about some social media stuff. And in particular, I got interested in taking a look at social media largely because having studied transit, gosh, for many years now, I'm not going to do the math because it's depressing, because it's a function of age. One of the persistent claims, and I think it's a very believable one when it's this persistent, is that transit suffers from a social stigma. Right, that it's associated with poverty, that it's a social service. It's you know, if you see this in mainstream advertisement for cars, for example, one of the most egregious examples was GM had a picture of a bus and its destination said creeps and weirdos on it. But it was one of those things that I'm like, okay, this is a persistent thing that practitioners in the field perceive, but I've never seen anyone measure it, and I don't know how you'd measure it. It's one of those things where, you know, if you send out a survey, right? If you use survey data, nobody ever beats their kids on surveys, right? There's no child abuse on surveys. People don't admit to doing things that actually have racism, classism, and all sorts of biases, so it'd be hard to measure that way. And so when social media sort of came along and I started to ask myself what kind of things we might use these data for, Twitter and other social media platforms and doing the content analysis there struck me as a way where you might get people's unguarded comments about transit in such a way that we might actually be able to measure stigma. And so that's what got me started. As I got into it, I think Twitter was evolving at the same time. It started on this project about 4 years ago, and Twitter was a different thing then than it is now. But it became very apparent to me that social media has a lot of strategic opportunities for public agencies, for marketing in particular, and very few public agencies really use it effectively for marketing or public relations. It's also a possibility for using it for democratic purposes, but it is not, as we've seen over and over, a straightforward platform. So for those of you, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but for those of you who pay attention to these kinds of things, when the New York Police Department, for example, called for users to send them images of the New York Police Department doing its job, Twitter users responded, and not in a good way for the agency, right? It was probably good for a democratic conversation, but it wasn't exactly self-promotion for the agency. What they got were a lot of pictures of police brutality. And that got picked up by the mainstream media, and as all of a sudden that social media use became a traditional media, mainstream media topic. And so even people who have no idea what Twitter is saw that material. So it's that moment, and in the paper where I described this process, in the 2008 election, there was this really key moment, I think, in political communication, where I really it became apparent to me that social media was really changing the way politicians were communicating with people. And if you really think about it, Barack Obama is a great image president. He is so good. If he does, I mean, talk about kissing babies. If he kisses a baby, there's a picture of it, and that picture is all over social media, and it's darling. It's extremely endearing. Well, in 2008, whoever was running John McCain's Twitter account sort of sent out a complaint about taxes. And this has sort of been in the media, and the reality TV persona Snooki, do you guys know who this is? Yeah. Well, she's sort of this perpetually orange person, and she is devoted to the use of tanning beds. And it became apparent to her that one of the new tax items was going to be a tax on tanning bed use, because tanning beds are not good for you. And so she tweeted, "I think this is terrible." And whoever runs McCain's shop tweeted back. And this exchange, right, this was very important because this is a boundary spanning moment in networks, right? The average Snooki follower on Twitter is probably not somebody who is reading John McCain's platform materials. They're probably not Republican National Convention goers. But they got McCain's anti-tax message through Snooki's retweeting. And moreover, this was covered in more mainstream media outlets that I could count. Right? And I was like, when I was watching that unfold, it was very clear to me that this was changing communication in ways that we probably want to think about. But finally, there's also just the fact that social media data, while there's lots of buzz about them, they're not easy to use, they're not easy to gather, and it's really not always clear what you have when you have them. What do they measure? So I wanted to explore that. In the context of media, I'm going to give you a really short primer on why I think we should care about this. In my recent research, I've gotten interested just in media more generally, mass media and large audiences. How do you communicate about things like high-speed rail and the technical aspects of things like high-speed rail and forecasts and numbers and cost estimates with mass markets and mass audiences of people who are then going to vote yes or no on a project, right? So that's one of the things that's been preoccupying me for the last few years. And the other side of it is the social media, which has both large and small audiences. There are some people, for example, like Barack Obama's feed, who have millions of people who may or may not see it, but are certainly subscribed to see it. And then there are people like me on Twitter who have tens and tens of followers. We do not command large audiences. But there's also something that's really interesting about social media is the immediacy and potential for both blasting and interacting. Certainly print media and video media were always something where you could respond to something that you saw, but it was usually in the form of a letter to the editor or a letter to the broadcaster or something like that that took some time. Now, you know, if you sit there and watch the State of the Union, as I do, I watch the State of the Union over here with my tweet deck over here, and I'm watching what he's saying, and I'm watching what people are saying as he's saying it, right? And I got to tell you, when Joni Ernst got on and started talking about bread sacks, all sorts of interesting things started happening over here on Twitter. The reason why we care is that we think that there are media effects. We've got about 6 decades, actually more, right? About 6 decades of experimental research on media effects. And you know, the preponderance of that data, when you get a literature that large, you're going to get mixed effects. But the overall consensus in that research is that media effects occur. They are very difficult to predict, but it is very clear that media influence what people think about, when they think about it, and in some instances how they think about it. Now, this is not media writing on individuals as passive people. There's a reason why people opt into the media markets that they opt into. So there's a dialectic going on there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we care about here is having influence. So everybody complains about negative campaign ads happening, advertisements happening. Everybody complains about it, and yet we see more and more and more of it. Why does that happen? Because the evidence suggests that it works. Right? Evidence from the experimental research suggests a couple of things that make it really difficult to figure out just how it works. Right? It's not just us being attached like little people on the matrix being fed messages. The consensus in the research is that media effects occur, but they're very hard to predict. And that one of the reasons why it can be very difficult to really talk about this, even in a policy setting, is that most people think that it doesn't affect them. This is something called the third person effect. It's one of my favorite parts of this literature. And that is, most of us are willing to grant that other people are influenced by the media, but I'm not. So the rest of you fools, right? All those dumb Fox News watchers, all those dumb MSNBC users, they're influenced by what they're watching. Me, I'm above all that. Right? And that's called the third person effect, and it's measurable and it's out there, and you're deluding yourself. Right? Chances are very good you're deluding yourself. What kinds of effects are we worried about? Well, first is just beliefs. Right? Ideas about what is true, what is frequent or pervasive, and how things work. So one of my favorite studies here is a study by Sandra Ball-Rokeach in Annenberg, asking people to make a cognitive map of what the most dangerous area in Los Angeles is. Right? And this is then when she looked at about 300 or so maps, there's a great deal of overlap, and it's all boys in the hood. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual statistical distribution of crime. It has a lot to do with where crime is reported and where television directs the gaze. Right? That's, I think, a very key idea of what we want to think about here. Attitudes. Right? Beliefs and attitudes are somewhat different. It's a fine point in the literature, and that is simply a normative evaluation. Right? This is something that happened. Right? That's a statement of fact. It's a claim, right, that you might be able to verify or not. That happened and it's a good thing, or that happened and it's a bad thing, that happened and it's an important thing. That last bit is an attitude, right? And you can also carry normative frames and contexts in the media that way. And then finally, there's the evaluative capacity, which sort of primes people to think about issues in a particular way. So I spend about 60 hours of programming complaining about waste in government. Waste in government, waste in government, waste in government, waste in government. And then I show you a news story on Barack Obama's trip abroad and how much it costs. Right? Those two things are linked, and chances are very good that if you have consumed that 60 hours of TV and it already sort of set with you, right, it squared with your own values already, that you're worried about waste in government, that gave you another frame or another way of thinking about, well, there's this story, the president has gone abroad and look at how much money it cost, and then the next step is, it was wasteful, right? It's a way of evaluating. And so these are the ways in which media effects sort of alter our priority organizing of how ideas work. Effects can occur. I mean, the bottom line is that most communication is hit or miss. Anybody who has been married for some time knows this. And everybody who is married in this room just laughed, because all of us have said to our spouse, did you take the garbage out? And have that spouse respond, no, the light's on in the living room. Or, yeah, there's popsicles in the freezer. So you know full well that whatever it is you said, they did not hear. And this is a simple matter of, just because you put something out there doesn't mean that people have seen it. So amongst my tens and tens of Twitter followers, they may not see a tweet that I've put out there. They may not be looking at it at that point. So just because the content is there doesn't mean that people have actually been exposed to it or that they've even really thought about it. But it's important to understand what's there in order to get to these later things. One of the things that we are pretty sure in the literature, that seems apparent from the literature, is that seeing or hearing information from multiple sources influences whether or not it has effect on you. So, for example, one of the things that's really interesting, and I'm going to show you how this works in transit, is that social media is one of those points where you can get it from a lot of different people. So Facebook, if you think about the way Facebook works, and you've got a cluster of friends that are very similar to you and that have similar attitudes, and they all forward the same news story, and you see that story 6 times from 6 different people that you know. Right? Now, some people in your family, for example, you discount them heavily. Right? You curate that. But truth be told, you are much more likely, and this is true for everybody regardless of your education level, much more likely to read something if somebody that you know or somebody that we respect has handed it to you. That's what we mean. There's also just the vividness or some sort of visceral aspect to it, and this is where images are so important to having a media effect. You can think about some of the iconic war photos. Right? The iconic war photos of the last 20th century and how much those are associated with particular military actions and how much information they convey. Right? If you look at the Pulitzer-winning photographs over the past 30-some years, you will really see some things that really alter the way you think about a particular situation. So that vividness or visceral aspect is another thing that we think pushes you in influence. I've already covered the trust in the source. There's also just sort of a magical match between, not magical, but between priming, framing, and your existing beliefs. You are much more likely to accept a message if it aligns with something that you're already prepared to hear. So, you've just spent 6 hours listening to government waste, and then somebody tells you that this is a government program and it's wasteful. You probably sat through all those 6 hours of programming because you think that there's probably waste, right? It's something that's important enough for you to spend 6 hours watching and thinking about. So that when you get that next message, it aligns with something you believed in the first place, and so it's confirming. A lot of marketing research and advertising is about affirming that you did the right thing to begin with. So the whole idea of car commercials is, oh my God, I just saw this beautiful car. I'm going to run out and spend $60,000 on this impulse buy. Now, a lot of this is aftermarket affirmations. I spent 60 grand on this damn car, and look, I see on TV that it makes me a stud. Right? Right? So that's the sort of thing that we're trying to get at there. With social media, like the volumes and volumes and volumes of research that we have on media effects, we don't have nearly as much on social media because it's new, it's hard to study. We don't know. Right? We don't know what its actual effect is in terms of influence. We've got to have a lot more empirical studies to go out there, but it's probably fair to assume that it does have an effect, given that so many other things have had effect. And that also it shares lots of the things that lead you to accepting messages, right? You get information from people that you opt into following, right? You follow people, I mean, unless you're like me and you like to follow people in National Review just to annoy them, right? You follow people, right? And I love it when they retweet me, right? You follow people that you want to hear from. Right? And it's this reinforcing cycle of, okay, this is the news that I'm interested in. They frame it in a way that I find really, helps me understand the world, and so I keep seeking from those folks. And that's more possible with the differentiated markets of social media than just about any other form of print or video. Right? The cable market in video, right, explodes all of this, and you're able to sort of pick and choose your news in ways that people like Jen and me, when we grew up, we had 3 channels. And then only if I stood there with tinfoil in my hands, right? So the differentiated market, video market that cable represents is a little bit mirrored in our many, many platforms. So there are the red edit users, and they have the tendency to be a little bit different than the other platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also those places that you go in there are a matter of self-selection and market differentiation. Anyway, social media is potentially more democratic. We have the capacity for people to really counter messages that are sent. Just like the New York Police Department's attempt to self-aggrandize in social media was immediately co-opted by people who were like, no, we have a different message, right? This is possible for all sorts of different services. And we don't want to lose that, I think, in particular on the government side. So why should we care? Why should public transit agencies care about this? Well, I think for those of you in this school, for those of you who do want to do policy and planning, we should care about the media writ large. You should care about print media, you should care about video, and you should care about social media simply because you want to understand, as citizens, how media messages are crafted. And when you, in turn, work for agencies, you want to understand how that is either working for or against the sort of policies and plans that you're working with. If we understand the media, we can examine those messages that we're given with more discretion. Those of you who follow me on Facebook know that half the things I share not just because not because I necessarily subscribe to the worldview, but because there's something cool happening in that media presentation. Right? Something new is happening. People are using media in a different way. And so having that expertise, I think, is actually really quite valuable in the public sector. It's always been in the private sector. We've always had advertising. We've always had marketing. And I think for transit agencies, it's a new horizon. We have agencies that are very good at it. And then we have agencies that really don't put any time into thinking about it. And my study, just in terms of foreshadowing, it does not suggest that we all need to leap out there and hire huge departments of public relations people. That is not what I'm suggesting. I am suggesting that we be aware. Media obviously can be a very public source of embarrassment. We also have that possibility for learning more about patrons immediately when we take to social media and take a look at what people are saying about service. It's important to communicate with your customers. Customer relations is important in any service, whether it's public or private. And then if you think about social media in that way, it's not just a way of crafting your own image, it's also a way of getting to know what people are thinking about as it's happening. So my case study is in US transit. As those of you who know me know, I am a giant transit nerd, and I get up most mornings, think about transit, and I think about it all day. It's an important case study for us simply because it has some fairly daunting public management issues. It's an important public investment priority in the US, but it has some fairly daunting public image issues. And one is simply those chronic operating deficits. The service loses money year in and year out. And there's only so much you can do about that. You've got to find money from somewhere, and one of the places that you need to go in order to make up that deficit are voters. So you will have your image with your customers and your patrons, but they're actually a small group of your financial supporters. Your other financial supporters are out there sitting on the county supervisor's board, and they're paying attention to their constituents, and they're paying attention to their mom. And when Mike Antonovich's sister calls him up and says, "Hey, did you see what happened over at Metro?" Right? This is all part of the parcel of what we have to deal with when we're in public sector institutions, even quangos like Metro. The other thing is simply that the data show, unfortunately, that transit is an inferior good in many metros. Do not get mad at me, planners. I love transit, but the data are what the data are. And the technical definition of an inferior good in economics is that as your income rises, you consume less of it. And that is true for public transit in every region in the United States except for one. And it's true for a limited portion of that region. Okay, so the fact is, with an inferior good, when you are selling an inferior good like ramen noodles and Budweiser, right? You have got to find a way to market your stuff and manage your image to people to find the financial support you need in order to be able to deliver the service. And so one of the aspects of public management that I think we should care about is essentially, what do people know about transit? So in order to know that, we have to figure out what content and images are out there on social media. So I have made an argument essentially that media affect how we think. Right? And now I want to get at, well, what's out there on media about transit? Now, I can't tell you whether or not this is influencing what people think. I don't have experimental data. But I also need to figure out the first step, which is the content, before I can get to the influence. And the content is hard enough as it is. So my point, so this is just a random term search for SEPTA. One of my favorite transit agencies ever. I love SEPTA. They used to have back in the day, they had the best tokens. Right? They were awesome. So you read through these messages, and what do they say? Even from the agency themselves. Oh, I'm late. The agency says, oh, we're late. A patron says, late. Another patron says, late. SEPTA says, oh, we're late. Late, late, late. SEPTA says again, we're late. Oh, SEPTA, hi, we're late. K. Marie says late. It don't even be my fault while I'm late. Where TF the trolley at, yo? I really hate SEPTA. So late, 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 late. And arguably what's worse from a marketing perspective is that the agency is contributing to this message. Right? Late, late, late. And then Boris Yeltsin at the bottom is hardly a ringing endorsement. Right? Now, I personally think that a senior citizen field trip sounds kind of cool. But it's not real clear that that's a ringing endorsement of service. Okay? I have over 64,000 tweets sampled over 4 years, and so hand coding that is not going to happen. So what do? I basically developed a machine learning algorithm to supervise some coding of these tweets. I used a standard sentiment scoring dictionary, very standard in the sentiment scoring literature by Hugh and Liu in 2004. It's the industry standard. If you want to go out and look at all your Yelp comments, and you've got a lot of them, this would be one of those dictionaries that you use. And then I did a word cloud to add some transit relevant words based on that word cloud. And so negative words are broke down, WTF, late, wait, waiting, delay, delayed, offline, scam, closed, epic fail, weirdo, pervy, crowded, crowded, jammed, skeevy, breakdown, broke down, ghetto, transit fail, and unsuck. Now, for those of you who are on Twitter, unsuck is one of those nomenclatures for satire accounts. And there are some metro companies that have pretty sharp and active satire accounts, like DC Metro. And so one of the things that I discovered over the course of the 4 years is that the more active the agency was in communicating with people, the less likely they were to get a satire account. Unfortunately, the Unsuck Metro, DC Metro account is not going anywhere, and he has a lot of followers. And he cuts the agency no slack. So in terms of sentiment scoring, here's a little nerdly bit for you. What the algorithm does is something actually very simple. It goes through and identifies text strings, and it compares them against the positive and negative words in the dictionary. If it is a negative, and if it's a match in either the positive or the negative, it's assigned a 1. And then sentiment is simply the sum of positive words minus the sum of negative words. Now, it's not clear, right? This is a very subjective way of doing this. It's not clear that something that, like, I love, 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 love the metro, right, which is going to show up with 4 positive words, is actually more positive than I effing love metro, right? We don't know, right? This is just, we're hoping that in the broad scope of this large data, that those kinds of idiosyncrasies sort of work themselves out. And this is going to be good enough to be going on with. Later on, I'm basically going to give up on the machine coding, and I'm going to do it by hand because I want to see much more specific things than what I can get here. Now we get into the part where we talk about the big data problems. Big data causes us all sorts of problems. Now, I am not one of those people who is going to give you a nice talk on big data because I'm still befuddled by it. With 64,000 observations, you have a great deal of statistical power, right? And we also have some befuddling things. And that is simply, can we use that social media data to understand how the images and messages are communicated about transit service? But that doesn't really help us. If we find volumes and volumes of complaints in 64,000 tweets, well, everybody complains. It's one of the first rules of customer service. In the Hugh and Liu dictionary, there are over 4,000 negative words. There are only 2,000 positive words. Right? We are a dissatisfied species, if the dictionary is any indicator. So everybody complains about a lot of stuff all the time. Right? So we need to have some way of figuring out whether people are actually complaining about transit the same or more or less than they complain about everything else in the world. That actually tells us something interesting in terms of research. It tells us something special. Second question is, can we use social media to separate information about service quality from stigma, prejudice, and bias, which is where I started. Which leads us to the second big data problem of, oh my God, there's racist, sexist bigots on the interwebs. Who would have thunk it? Right? Going through and doing a content analysis on all of this speech and all of this texting, you're going to find sexism, you're going to find racism, you're going to find bigots. Right? What's interesting is there more of that junk about transit patrons than there are about other types of people in the world? That's when we get into something where we might be able to discover something interesting using these data. So how can we know how transit stacks up on social media against other services in terms of complaining and stigma? Keeping in mind that apparently, if you skim through Yelp, nobody's happy ever. So my approach, using my sentiment scoring, I use a two-part sampling structure. I use 5 celebrities and 5 villains. I actually use more than that, but I only present 5 because otherwise it gets too cluttered. I use 5 celebrities because celebrities are basically in the business of positive PR, generating positive buzz. If you follow the work of Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, celebrities are celebrities because they get people to believe nice things about them and are interested in them. Right? 5 villains. Right? People who have done bad things or institution that everybody hates. Because, right, if everybody hates them, people are going to say nasty things about them all the time. People are going to say nice things, or at least relatively normatively good things about the celebrities most of the time, even their own self-promotion. So what this gets me is something that I can use to test my algorithm. Right? When you've got 64,000 things, it's very hard to tell if you've scored it properly. Now, I went through and did a random sample, and I checked it, and I hand-checked it, and it looked fine. But if I can nail down the extremes of my distribution, and my algorithm has scored those properly, I can feel a little bit better about the ones in the middle, where there's going to be less extreme scoring. Okay, so that's just there to help me evaluate the algorithm. This is actually, these groups are the actual statistical tests and groups that I want to look for differences between. So transit companies, they're my group that I actually care about. Airlines struck me as a good comparison because they are also a ticketed service. They're a mobility service. You can complain about other patrons. Boy, I sure do. Right? You can complain about management. You can complain about a lot of the same service things that you can complain about on transit. There's no room. This flight is late. It's too hot in here. By the way, for your information, for those of you who actually do work in transit, give up on trying to please anyone on climate. Nobody is ever happy, ever, ever. In the summer, people are too hot, or they're too cold, because it's too hot and cold on the same bus. I kid you not, I can show you evidence of this. Right? Give it up. But you can complain about the same things. They're parallel services. One of the key differences is one is privately managed, the other one is publicly managed, and I have an interesting story to tell you about them. I used parks because Professor Banerjee suggested that I pick some other public space or public service where people are encountering others that they might complain about. I used social welfare programs because I thought, hey, this is another group of social programs that are likely to have a stigma. I'm likely to see racialized language. I'm likely to see language relating to poverty, right, and sexism there. And I also did police departments because they were just another municipal service. They're, people tweet about them. And I collected all these data before the Eric Garner and Michael Brown's decisions. I mean, I can't wait to see what's in there now. I haven't touched these data for a while, but I've been scraping and scraping and scraping. Back then, there wasn't that much activity. Now I strongly suspect that I would see a very different profile on what's Twitter, but it's simply another control. My transit companies are LA Metro, New York Metro, TransLink, TTC, BART, CTA, DC Metro, Philadelphia, MBTA, and TriMet. So Matt, you remember when I had you looking up the award-winning, right? The APTA award-winning, you contributed to this, because I was looking for ones that are generally about the same in terms of service performance. Now, I can't tell you for sure that they're about equal, right? I can't. According to this, there are differences in what people report in service, but it is very hard to objectively measure service, right? As Sandeep will tell you. There's a lot of reporting of on-time performance, but it's very subjective, and we don't have any way of auditing that data. If you do this in terms of customer complaints per mile, right? One of the first rules of understanding that is that entitled rich people will complain at 6 times the rate as not entitled poor people, even when they are objectively getting better service. So I want you to understand that I did try to sort of keep it at a level where the transit service was pretty darn good as you see in the United States, but that there may be service differences, and we're not going to be able to tell that from here. You're going to see how much people complain about service, but we don't know how much of that is just frustrated entitlement, how much of that is just people performing on public media or social media. Okay, now you can't read all this, but I want you to see the whole thing. And that is simply because my algorithm in general did what I wanted it to do. This is exactly what you would expect to see knowing what we know about positive things, right? We've got our celebrities up top, and it's much closer to 0 on the positive side than it is on the negative side. Again, simply because people are not very likely, they're much less likely to be positive than they are to be negative, right? So I get Bill Shatner at the top. By the way, people are less nice to black celebrities on Twitter than they are to white celebrities on Twitter. And my bottom shows me exactly what I want to see. Right? My bottom has exactly what I want to say. Transportation Security Agency, the Oakland PD, poor buggers, ended up there by accident with the villains. But in general, my bin Laden is the very worst. Michael Dunn, another killer, in the Westboro Baptist Church. Does not have a fan base on Twitter. I'm sure you're shocked. Right? But this tells me that in general, my coding did what it was supposed to do. Because again, this is code that I wrote. You can't just take it out of Stata or some sort of package. You got to do it yourself, and you want to make sure that it's doing what you think it's doing. So with that, I'm going to show you this bit here, right, which is where all the transit and public agencies are. Let's go take a look at this. Okay, so it's important that we understand this scale. Right, when you've got this volume of data, a lot of things are going to be near 0. Your averages are going to be near 0, and that's great. We go over to 0.5 over here, because again, people just don't lavish praise all over. We go to negative 0.1 over there. We're looking at averages across vast volumes of comments. Our 0 line basically means neutral. There is no sentiment. A tweet that has no sentiment is something like, I am at Union Station. Right? I am giving a talk in Dorotev, right? There's nothing there, right? In order to have sentiment, I would have to be, I am in Union Station and it's the best thing ever, right? So there's my 0, there's another 0 line, and there are my transit companies. There are my transit companies. I've got 3 just positive, and I've got 3 just negative, and statistically those are undifferentiable from each other. But I do have some differences between SEPTA, MBTA, and TransLink, and TriMet that are actually kind of interesting. Right, interspersed in there, there's a couple of airlines. Boy, people hate US Airways. And there are some social welfare programs, TANF, Medicare, Welfare Queen, and Obamacare. For those of you who read the paper, I did a control. I did the Affordable Care Act as a term, and I did Obamacare. And the Affordable Care Act is up here in the positive, and Obamacare is down here in the negative, which is another double check of my algorithm. So you know somebody who's referring it as the Affordable Care Act is probably sympathetic, and somebody who's referring it to as Obamacare is probably Negative. They're not happy with it. So it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then our last bit here are the police departments, which are tucked in there and in general also on the negative side. Sacramento PD is actually up a little farther. They got some sort of halo effect that I can't explain, but they're just so that you can look again are our transit companies. Now let me reiterate, I think a lot of people have looked at these data and they've been like, oh man, CTA is ranked so much lower. I've lived in Chicago. The CTA actually provides very good transit service. I mean, it's good, you know? I mean, transit service is transit service. I mean, you have to deal with things you don't always want to. It's one of the things that I think is really important about our dialogue in public transit. And it's one of the things that I think you planners are partially responsible for, right? In the advocacy discussions of transit, it's always, oh, it's clean and it's fast and it's wonderful and it's this and it's that and it saves the world, right? And that's great, except for when it's not clean and it's not fast. Here's a perfect example. Customer service and customer satisfaction is often more linked with meeting expectations than delivering higher levels of service. So Southwest is a terrible airline. I am saying it on camera. Southwest, you suck, and I never buy tickets from you. Why? Because I am a patron who likes amenities. I like big seats, I like assigned seats, I like lots of comforts. Southwest doesn't want me because Southwest doesn't do any of those things. Southwest tells its customer that it does a couple things. What does it tell them? Direct? Free checked bags, that's nice. But it's direct service, regional, cheap. And what does it deliver? On time. And because it's at a regional level, right? It's using extra hub space. It delivers cheap, direct, right? And usually on time.
It's the Walmart of airlines.
Well, but it's targeting its market because there are those of you out there who could care less. Right? My brother could care less. You could shove him in the cargo hold of most airlines if it saved him $4. Right? He could care less. And this is what I mean, is that all of you have different customer preferences for a whole bunch of different things. I am not a Southwest customer. But there are plenty of people like my brother who are like, it gets me there, I don't care, they can strap me on top. Okay? And routinely, Southwest comes out way ahead of other airlines on customer satisfaction surveys because the customers that they are serving know full well that they are getting cheap and direct and on time, and that's all they're getting. They're not getting obsequious flight attendants. They're not getting lots of amenities. They're not getting any of those things because they don't care about any of those things. They just want to get to San Francisco for about $100. Right? Okay, so that is actually a reasonable thing, and that is one of the key things about customer management in customer service, which is you cannot tell me that service is always, always, always going to be on time, because even in the most beautifully run transit system, in most parts of the world, breakdowns happen. Drivers get sick. They encounter incidents on the road. Right? Things happen on public transit. Sometimes you're going to have to sit next to somebody you don't like very much. Sometimes there's going to be rude people. It's life. It's real life on transit. And so making it the wonderland in marketing may not actually be serving us all that well. So on the CTA, one of the things, the differences that I'm going to show you is this is online chatter. I don't actually think, objectively, that there's much difference between CTA and SEPTA. I really don't. I've ridden both of these systems extensively. They are both pretty darn good systems. But there's a pretty big difference between the CTA's customer service and SEPTA's customer service. In terms of talking to people on the phone, in terms of emailing them back when they're approached. So in NOVA responses, you're going to get significant results with this much data. So basically, when you take a look at the differences amongst groups with ANOVA, there are significant differences in sentiment. You're likely to see them. What's kind of interesting are the post hoc tests. Here you can see the difference between the most highly ranked and the low ranked services. So people love parks. Parks are right up there with celebrities. And so as a result, we see a statistically significant difference in the sentiment between parks and police and parks and airlines, transit and parks, police, airlines, and transit and airlines. Right? Now that's interesting. One of the things that made me really interested in this was, okay, welfare and parks are about the same. We can't find a distinguishable difference. Welfare and airlines, welfare and police, welfare and transit police. So transit services are ranked the same as social welfare services and police departments, and differently from parks. Now, for those of you who love public transit, wouldn't you rather have it ranked up by parks? I would. People love the parks. And these are randomly selected parks. I thought I would get at least one dud in there. I didn't. I also did some regional controls to just see if people in Boston complain more, right? So I did Boston Parks and Boston Transit, because I'm like, these people are brutal. When you look through the Boston tweets on MBTA, which is pretty good service, those people are brutal. Man, there's somebody sitting there and they're going, this train is 3 minutes late. I'm going, dude, that sounds like nirvana to me. 3 minutes? Right, so I'm like, maybe there's some regional effect in the amount of complaining and tweeting going on. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Bostonians are much nicer to their parks than they are to the transit. So anyway, wouldn't you like to be up there by parks? Well, one of the things that I noticed when going through it is simply by breaking it down by code and looking for transit sigma, you see here, this is the amount of the corpus, service-related content. It was late, it was dirty, the escalator was broken. These are all related to service, right? My flight was canceled. I called 911 and the police didn't come. I can't figure out my mom's Medicare forms. These are all service-related complaints, and they're all valid things to say. Over here has to do with patron behavior. Right? Okay, so this jerk sitting next to me on the phone is taking the armrest. Right? The person in the B seat is listening to music really loud, right? Those are those kinds of complaints. There's only so much service providers can do about that. They can ask you to stop, but there's only so much policing you can do. Then there's just race, class, gender, age, and size slur. Right? God, this old person is taking forever to sit down on the airplane. We got to get out of here. What the hell's wrong with them? Why do they let geriatrics out? Right? That kind of thing. Right? You should see the Twitter commentary. Here we have social welfare, race, class, gender, age, and size. The black is positive, the white is negative. Ouch. Look at our transit. The only thing that's even remotely comparable is social welfare. So you compare this and compare that. There's a huge difference in how much slurs are being said about fellow transit patrons. And I'm like, that's interesting. That is measurable stigma. So what do we find? And again, keeping in mind that our ANOVAs are going to show a lot of positive results, a lot of significant results with this level of statistical power. When we take the slurs out, look what happens. There's difference between parks and airlines, police and parks, transit and parks, welfare and parks. Okay, we got the hint, everybody loves parks. But at this point, when you take the slurs out, transit and airlines become indistinguishable, statistically. Now, when you get an indistinguishable result with this level of statistical power, there's no difference, emphatically. This is actually a really interesting result, right? Because we have been tearing our hair out for years in public transit going, you know what? If we just privatized this, it would be ever so much better managed. Well, we don't actually have any evidence about how well managed either of these services are. But we do know that when I take out the garbage about not liking other patrons, people complain about airlines and transit statistically exactly as much. Right? So the degree that perception matters as much as reality, people hate airlines too, apparently. Well, this is interesting. I thought you guys would be excited about this. So here we have this indistinguishable result. Transit company scores come out. They're basically the same as airlines. Now, I think that's really interesting. Oops, we're going the wrong way. Stop. Yeah, this is when your cute animations are not cool anymore. So one of the things I wanted to know is there any way to distinguish what happens with this online chatter when agencies do different things? And so one of the things I did was I went out and I pulled a hand-coded sample randomly from all of that data. And I wanted to see if there was any difference amongst agencies that just blast out their problems. This is late, we're late, we're late, we're late, 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 versus agencies that actually engage in active customer service. Hello, user X, you're complaining about dirt on the platform. Which platform are you talking about so I can send somebody out there to get it? right? So SEPTA has gone on and off with online customer service, and they're a really good test case because they did it for a while. It was going fairly well. I think they lost their intern. And their sentiment scores just went boom, right? I can track this in the data. And then they really actively committed to having somebody online announcing, hi, my name is Bill, I'm your online customer service representative, right? And they usually run under SEPTA Social, and their sentiment scores after they instigated this went up again. Right? This is versus the blast style communication. The CTA, remember it was the lowest ranked, right? The CTA is one of those agencies that is just tweeting its problems to the world. Nerd stuff, such a stratified sample of tweets by user type, satire agency, it's blah, blah, you can read the paper if you care. 5,000 tweet hand-coded with students. I did do this with some students. I eventually abandoned it because I could never get a Krippendorf's alpha that was acceptable. So I went through and did it myself, and then I had a student check to make sure that my own coding met the criterion. Agency, misspelled, don't do this on job talks, but fortunately I already have a job, you guys are stuck with me. Agencies, Twitter behavior, sampled on 60 different days, selected randomly over a four-year period, and grouped according to what I called a dialogue score, which is the ratio of text used in interaction to, on top of all tweeted text. So it's the percentage of their online content that is devoted to interacting versus all of it. So if an agency engages with a lot of dialogue, they'll get a high D score. The second thing that I had to do with the hand-coded, because it was driving me nuts, is that the machine coding cannot capture images, and there's a lot of content in images. This image has a very clear message, and it's very clearly negative. Right? Although I actually think it'd be kind of fun to see the sloths. Right? I have seen more pictures of poop on transit than you care to talk about. People take pictures of this, people take pictures of that, right? These are all clearly conveying a sentiment, but I don't capture it with the machine learning. Now, there are computer scientists who are working to try to be able to do that, but that's beyond me. So I sat down with those images and tracked them and coded them according to content this time out. And so what you get here is you have a D score or a dialogue score, and you can tell there's actually quite a bit of variation. Right? Bart doesn't tweet very much. Bart has gone in and out. It occasionally has somebody online, then they disappear, and then they come on and they're interactive. But in the sample, they actually revealed as being relatively low. LA Metro is very good. Right? They are very good. If somebody tweets about LA Metro, they usually are pretty good about getting back to you. The same is true of TransLeak. TTC, which owns its online dialogue about itself, tweets over 90 times a day. Right? The other sort of interactive thing that I haven't quite figured out how to capture yet is just differences in following behavior and retweeting behavior. So these agencies have real differences in how much they reciprocate online, and I haven't really been able to figure out how to do that yet. I scored everything by conduct, facilities, climate, security, things that are really related to things that the transit company can do something about versus patron behavior and slurs. And once again, I end up at the high level with ANOVAs being able to show significant differences in sentiment by interaction. So agencies that have higher levels of interaction enjoy higher sentiment scores. They get much less complaining. Now, sometimes that means that it's less negative. It doesn't mean that you jump into the positive realm of sentiment, but it does mean that the tone is moderated. It is associated with a more moderate tone. It's also clear from the data that there are fewer slurs related to race, class, and gender when there is somebody online responding to people. And what you find is that they're not responding to the racists and the bigots, right? For example, one of the most artful tweets in this sort of universe was somebody who tweeted something about ghetto kids on SEPTA, and the SEPTA social person tweeted that person back and say, is there disruptive behavior? Do we need to act on it? And then that person just shut the hell up. We never heard from that again. And that's kind of a reminder that you're not just tweeting to your own little group of bigoted friends. Right? Other people see this. You don't have to confront this as racism qua racism. You just sort of let people know it's what I call the online equivalent of eyes on the street. You're not just tweeting into a vacuum when that happens. I think that's what's going on. I can't prove it. I don't have the data. I don't believe that the differences in service are really that significant, but the way that people talk about service is different when agencies have someone interacting than when they just blast out, I've got problems. You see here, and again, because we have so much statistical power, we're going to be able to detect very small differences, but that's actually what you want to see here because we're talking about a very narrow sentiment, range of sentiments here. We see it with class and race and gender. It doesn't come with disability or LGBT. But in summary, highly interactive dialogue feeds have statistically more positive sentiment. They also have statistically fewer slurs. And they also have more public retweets and responses to solicitation for planning, but not public management solicitations. So I also coded public management announcements and planning announcements. And as a result of dialoguing with people in general, our other Twitter patrons are much more likely to retweet, oh, we've got a new bike station at Station X, than if you're just blasting that information out. If you have sort of created a dialogue with people, it seems like they're much more likely to see your tweets and they're much more likely to retweet you if they've seen you dialogue before. We don't know what the causal mechanisms are here. I can't tell you what they are. It may be that these companies that do more online activities are just facing people who react more positively to them, and so with that positive reinforcement, they're much more likely to put themselves out there. It may be that all of that, creating more content and interacting with people actually gives people something to respond to. It gives them content instead of, as in the case with the satire accounts, blasting out information, creating a communication vacuum that somebody else steps into, right? And that somebody else is highly negative, right? It's just this universe of trying to help people understand what you're doing. And when you do that in an interactive way, you co-construct that meaning in such a way that people are much more likely to buy into it and then echo what you've said about yourself. Or what you've created, the image that you have created about yourself with them, they are much more likely to sort of hand off into the rest of the world. Again, I don't know. I don't have experimental data. I just have the content, and I have these associations, which I think are interesting. I only use one social media platform, and I only have 10 agencies. This is the other problem with big data, is I have mass volumes of data about 10 entities. 10 entities in the statistical world is not very much. So we don't know how well this generalizes.
We looked at the people who were tweeting and then looked at their other tweets. Mm-hmm. Could that be used to help adjust how you analyze their gripes?
Oh, it could, but that is empirically a hard thing to do. You can do that, but that means going through and you think about this, I have on any given day, several hundred people tweet about the New York public transit, right, the New York Metro. And so I would have to go through and scrape 100 different users just for that one day. It would have to be automatic, but it's also a mass volume of data. I could try to tell if a person's just a chronic complainer, but that's just empirically a step farther. Right, I did this on my little Macintosh. You start to get into who's connected to who, and then what those characteristics are of the people who are connected. That becomes computationally a much bigger smoke.
I wonder if you thought about, it seemed like the big difference or stigma would be people who don't ride transit, and so people in their cars. And I think people probably tweet about traffic and other drivers as well. So I wondered if you considered comparing, how people react to driving.
Sure.
That's
a good suggestion.
Yeah. Another question was, your measure of stigma was what people in the transit system were saying about other people.
It's usually about other patrons, yes. But the reality of it is, this could be somebody in his living room just writing nasty things about somebody he imagines taking public transit. I don't know. But basically, in the paper, I give you a sample of how things are coded. So, yeah, the slurs having to do with this, some of the things for anybody who's read the paper, it's really depressing. Some of the things that people say, it's just, I can't imagine it. Think of the things that people say about kids. They're children, But racial epithet, kids on the train listening to loud music. Right, now that gets coded in two ways. Because one strikes me as a legitimate complaint, and the other one is just a slur. And one is, I don't want to listen to everybody else's music on transit either. So the one is a patron behavior complaint, and the second one is a slur code.
Yeah, those are definitely slurs, but I wondered if there's a stigma if you're on the train too. You know, I wondered if it's people are, like you said, racist bigots, and blah, 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 and that's what we're seeing. So I wondered if I would interpret it as stigma. This is stigmatized service. I'm also.
But if you think about the third person effect and other ways of dealing with cognitive things, of course you're not part of the problem. That's why you're allowed to comment. So yeah, I'm kind of sticking with it as a measure of stigma, because it's reinforcing, I think, the larger social association of transit as being a service for people who can't do anything, you know, who don't have anything better to use.
Did you control at all, or were you able to, for rail versus bus, and whether the sentiment scores differ by either? Because I think that just some nature of complaints is going to be different by each.
Yeah, no, no, I did not, because I can't control, because most of these agencies are mixed providers. Most of them provide both bus and rail.
And there's usually no identifier in the data.
Sometimes there is. Sometimes there is, but it's very inconsistent. So if somebody says they're on the L, I know where they're at, right? But that's not necessarily going to show up on just a term search, right? It's going to show up if they say on SEPTA. And because I'm worried to some degree about branding, I don't know. I could if I wanted to. Many people do have their geolocating tags on. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't necessarily want to touch those. I'm not sure how I feel about them.
Yeah, so your results of your data, do you compare them, for example, that agencies that have their own research, their own
I
survey?
do not think that this is actually representative of service. I think this is about chatter. And I think agencies, if anybody wants to see it, you know, they can see this stuff if they want. I'm happy to send it. But I'm very careful in the paper to caveat that, you know, some of this stuff is just junk. You know, most of us would be fortunate to live in a world served by the New York Metro. They provide a lot of service, and much of it is very good, and it's remarkably affordable. It's gone up a lot, but it's remarkably affordable. And man, you just do not want to be a tubby person on New York Transit. Those people are brutal. They're tweeting about stuff like that. And that is stuff that it's not the transit agency's problem, except to the degree that they want to control their brand. Right? That's what I'm trying to get at here. You know, and they want to deal with they want to have their customer service people doing what is most effective in the customer service realm. What we find here is actually really quite interesting is it doesn't require a lot of interaction. It just takes some. You don't have to respond to every single tweet, because God, who has time for that? But responding for some actually really does seem to be correlated with real differences in how people talk about your service online.
I, of course, was fascinated by the correlation of airlines and transit. After we take out some other stuff, being a veteran of the airlines, I would agree that service is probably worse than transit in many, many ways. But the thing that you took out were the slurs, right? So how do you explain the greater frequency of slurs related to transit versus the airlines?
My suspicion is there's enough class homogeneity on airlines that people are much less likely to pop on there and believe that it's socially acceptable to say something nasty. What you see in terms of stigma on airlines really has to do with people's size and people's age. Those kinds of slurs are far more common. There's a lot of ageism, right? And there's a lot of people who are mad at people like me, who are tubby. But I think the class homogeneity and the racial homogeneity on airlines actually exempts a lot of those patrons from, you know, I'm mad about something. I'm mad about the fact that the kids are playing their music. But I've also got this sort of thing in my heart about black kids, and so I'm going to add that angry thing there too.
So you talked a lot about how, like, Southwest, for example, doesn't oversell what they're doing. So do you think that these transit agencies are basically overselling it? I mean, should we just be more real that you're going to be faced with things that are bad, and that's just the reality of it? But right now we're fantasizing it by saying, look at this beautiful ride you can have downtown. But you're going to see that thing.
I think the advocacy universe of transit is much different from the agencies, right? And so our advocacy dialogue, and we've got a room full of planners, so we have a room full of transit advocates, right? And so the advocacy dialogue is very, 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 very positive. The agency's job, I think, is to sort of help people understand what's realistic. So one of the best uses of Twitter I've ever seen was a point where somebody was like, God, this escalator is still broken, the stupid bastards at... And one of the customer service representatives wrote back and said, I am so sorry that that escalator is out, but that's not ours, it's the Long Island Railroad's. And I will tweet this to their customer service representative for you, right? And that's that immediate point of contact moment of, you know what, it really does bite, right? When the escalator is out and it's like 6 stories of stairs, but we didn't do it, right? We didn't do it. And also, you know, just sort of being able to say, you know, I'm really sorry, there does seem to be a problem on the platform, I'm going to call security, or we've got cameras there, we're looking into it. It really does seem to make a difference. And that's what I mean by it's a co-constructed process where people are sort of understanding what is realistic. Right? Again, I was dead shocked when there were people complaining about a train that's 3 minutes late. My God, I stare into space for long periods of time while I'm waiting for transit. Yeah, it's in Boston. I was just, wow, you know, 3 minutes, this is service that many of us would kill for, and you're grumpy. And you're not the only grumpy person in the Twitter feed.
Do you think that there's fewer complaints on Twitter about an airline because you simply can't tweet while you're in the air, whereas on Metro, you can tweet while you're on Metro?
You can tweet while you're on Metro?
And on BART.
I have to say that BART has one of the most entertaining feeds. You know, you get more, the guy next to me has no pants on BART than you do anywhere else. Right? Those of you who follow me on Facebook, there was this whole time period where you saw the most entertaining tweets. Right? Oh, it was very, very funny. I don't know. It's a good question. Now, some airlines are allowing you that access. And I do encounter people who are tweeting online, but it's usually people who are happy that they have Wi-Fi. Because it's so new. So it's a good question.
I kind of buy your stigma thesis, but I like best is your finding about the interactive dialogue as a way of keeping people in line better than we just have announcements. Especially if there's going to be people sending out really negative messages, it would change the whole tenor for everybody. That's really a valuable finding.
I actually think the most immediately valuable thing from this is to just basically tell agencies to stop tweeting their announcements, their late announcements. They don't need to do that. There are apps in the world where people can go and they can follow their particular line and they can get the specific information. They don't need to scroll through all of the agency tweets announcing their service problems. In some respects, that's a little bit like Pizza Hut tweeting every time it's got a late pizza delivery, right? Or United Airlines saying, yeah, we lost somebody else's luggage today. You know, you don't necessarily want to do that. And so we do have the capacity with smartphones and all sorts of other things to be able to do this in a much more precise way.
So instead of like delay announcements, what do you suggest that they blast out?
I suggest they actually use it for customer service, complaints that can be addressed in that moment, right? So if somebody says, what's going on, the train, I've been waiting for the train for 20 minutes, jump on and say, hey, you know, if you've got customer service. Again, I don't know what the cost benefit on this is, so I don't necessarily know that this would cost out for agencies, but that's, you know, responding to inquiries about why it's late. And then 2, questions about, okay, about planning. So SEPTA has a different service because there's a big Eagles game on a weekend, right? Answering questions. Hey, wait a minute, is this line redirected? Right, that's a great use of something like social media. It's very similar, I know this is a letdown, but it seems to me like it's very similar to how you'd use the telephone. Right? I need to know information, I need you to interact, right? And it's a specific use of, like, this is a useful answer, right? And I don't have to wade through the volumes of service announcements, and they do both, right? They say, okay, we've got these detours, but the chances of the person catching that tweet, we don't know. But when at Dr. Schweitzer tweets, hi SEPTA, are you going to be changing the L line over the weekend? And they can tweet me back, right? That's an excellent use of Twitter. And what you find is that when you do that sort of thing, the Dr. Schweitzer of this world, when you put out, hey, would you take our bike share survey? You get a lot more people tweeting your bike share survey announcement.